it's more looked at and understood when there's like major blood sugar dysregulation in the conventional space. So
Yeah.
a lot of the conventional docs know that if someone has diabetes, it could affect gut function in major ways, especially like the nerves within the gut being
Hmm.
damaged by blood sugar swings. But I think there's a lot of people that don't have that severe of blood sugar dysregulation, but still have blood sugar issues to where it really affects their gut. So I think like there's a lot of understanding in the conventional space, but I feel like in the functional medicine space and integrative space, people might touch on it, but I don't feel like it's really touched on enough. Do you feel the same way?
Yeah, pretty frequently. I think that it's tough because we're in such a sugar addicted society. And like on the
Right.
one hand, we have people who are really sugar addicted and carb addicted, and those people could probably use some restriction in that sense. But then there's a lot of people who are like, I have candida or I have SIBO and I can't eat a carrot because it has carbs, right? Or I can't eat
Right.
whatever. And it's like, like those are the people where it can get really tough to have these conversations because I don't want to send somebody down the rabbit hole of restriction more than I absolutely need to. But yeah, I do think that both hyper and hypoglycemia, being high blood sugar and low blood sugar, is a pretty big deal breaker for the body in general, let alone the gut. And you hit the nail on the head with the nerves and the motility in the gut being a really big focal area.
Right. And I love that you're bringing up the two sides of the coin because the standard American diet that's really high in carb, sugar is definitely going to lead to more blood sugar swings. But I also think concurrently in the SIBO space, if you are cutting a lot of carbs and going to the extremes in that way, it could lead to more blood sugar dysregulation, which I don't think is talked about enough.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going low carb, and you're having blood sugar dysregulation, sometimes people will even cut more carbs thinking that
Yeah.
it's going to help, but it
Yeah.
could just be adding more stress to the system and more blood sugar dysregulation. So
Yeah.
I think the answer isn't always to cut carbs wise. And I think that's what you were getting at when you were
Yeah.
like, we work in this weird SIBO space where so much focus is on starving things out. Um, but I do think that going down that rabbit hole could make blood sugar dysregulation much worse.
And I do think it could be like maybe not a SIBO root cause in the sense I don't know if diabetes would be enough to cause SIBO intrinsically, but it could definitely keep you stuck and prevent you from
Right,
fully treating the SIBO, if nothing else.
right. I've never worked directly with someone with type 2 diabetes and SIBO,
Mm,
but I'd almost venture to say that it could be a root cause in and of itself. Like again, it's hard to know for sure, but
yeah,
if it is kind of frying those nerves,
I think it could be.
and I know like things like gastroparesis are really common
Hmm.
in. So, there's going to be an inherent motility issue if
Yep.
you have wildly uncontrolled or even not wildly, like still uncontrolled glucose levels
Yeah.
in type 2 diabetes. But yeah, I mean, I definitely think if you're someone that has diabetes and it's uncontrolled, it's going to be really problematic.
Yeah.
And usually I would say, like, uh, even with type 1 diabetes, I think even then, again, if you're having these uncontrolled swings,
Yeah.
it's going to still create a lot of problems gut wise.
Yeah. Agreed.
Um, but I also think like an interesting thing about blood sugar is the idea that, gut imbalances can drive blood sugar swings as well. Or if the gut is imbalanced and dysbiotic, it's going to cause a lot of inflammation if there's leaky gut
Yeah.
there, and these endotoxins are seeping through the blood,
Hmm.
causing a lot more inflammation, a lot of this low grade chronic inflammation. The term used is this metabolic endotoxemia
Hmm.
term, which is basically saying that you have endotoxins seeping out into the blood and they're affecting your metabolism in a negative
Yeah.
way. So I do think that there's a lot of interconnections of like how the gut could drive some blood sugar swings,
Hmm.
but also vice versa. If you're having blood sugar swings, it's going to affect gut function. So there's like a lot of interplay there. Um, too. And I always wonder with things like type 2 diabetes as a whole, not even in the SIBO space, type 2 diabetes, a lot of these chronic issues like cardiovascular disease, um, uh, diseases that affect the metabolism in big ways, how they could potentially be connected to gut function, even if they're not having
Oh
gut
yeah.
symptoms.
Yeah.
Um, and there being this blood sugar effect in those particular conditions. Just it's mind blowing to me that there's such a strong connection between leaky gut and the what's going on in the gut and these chronic conditions that are, I mean, huge in our
Yeah.
country. Um, and I think because I went through the conventional route,
Hmm.
and a lot of my friends and cohorts that I went to school with are working within these populations. Um,
Yeah.
and I think in the conventional space, no one really owns the microbiome. Like, I guess
Yeah.
potentially GI docs might think they do, but they don't know enough about the
Meanwhile,
microbiome.
they don't order poop tests, so
Right, exactly. So no one's really owning the microbiome. I think that uh, I wish that dietitians there was a stronger connection being made between the microbiome and chronic disease. And I think it's slowly coming, but I
yeah.
do think in order to make really big changes in the chronic disease world, we need to make that connection and start working on gut function. And I think it's hard to make that connection because they might not have any gut symptoms,
Yeah.
but yet they have terrible gut problems that are underlying some of their chronic diseases. So
Isn't
that's a
it?
hard connection to make.
It's really wild. Like, the longer I practice, the more I'm astounded that the human body is so resilient. And yeah, there could be people with really wild gut problems that are basically asymptomatic. Yeah, no, I think that the nutrition profession broadly should be all about the microbiome, and some are to their credit, but it's not broad across,
Right.
not in conventional settings at least. But to go back to that, I will share, and I think that we talked about this before we hung up from our last podcast when we were just chit chatting. I became really interested a couple years ago in the idea of continuous glucose monitoring for non-diabetics even. And there was a study out of Israel. I forget how many years ago it was, maybe
Right.
2015, 2016, where they were looking at, I believe it was a cohort of people with type 2 diabetes, if I remember correctly. And
Mm-hmm.
they looked to see when they were continuously monitoring their blood sugar, so like every 5 or 15 minutes or whatever it was, looking to see, all right, when you eat this meal, do you get a spike? Like if both of us today ate white rice, maybe the white rice would throw me way off and make my blood sugar go way high, but then your blood sugar not so much. But then both of us sit down for another meal and we both have white potato and I'm fine and your blood sugar goes through the roof. So there's this idea that yes, you could eat lower amounts of sugar or, low glycemic or even keto, but there is some individuality to people's blood sugar responses. And this has been really freaking cool to start observing. But that study, they basically concluded that like some people can eat a sandwich with white bread and it does nothing to their blood sugar, and some people get a big spike, and some people will eat, sushi or white rice and get a big spike, and some won't. And what that study did was that they looked at the microbiome and they said, all right, can we correlate it with something that we're seeing in stool testing? And they did. So then they did another study, like within, a year or so later, where they took another cohort of type 2 diabetics. They did stool testing first, and then they tried to predict their blood sugar patterning based on the stool test. And they, to at least some extent, were able to successfully predict using stool tests. So then, of course, they came out with a commercial product and a stool test that you could purchase for like $300.
Right.
Um, I got one of those. We were one of the first people to order that. I got one on my husband, and I was not impressed at the time, at least. Maybe they've updated it since then, but I wasn't super impressed. But I liked the general premise of, oh, hey, the blood sugar response to food can be very individualized. And now I have gotten in the habit of, certainly with type 2 diabetic patients, but even patients who are trying to figure out their blood sugar and they just need to collect more data. I've had people go to their primary care or their OBGYN or something, and request a prescription for a continuous glucose monitor. And actually, now to the point, I'm wearing one. There we go. I'm wearing one right now. And it's really fascinating and insightful to collect this kind of data and see just what things mess with your blood sugar and what doesn't. And I know I've been texting you my pictures every morning, like, look, my
I
blood
know.
sugar dipped at 4 o'clock in the morning. What is that about? But it's really fascinating to see that. So that's actually something, I think the Libre, the one that I got, the Freestyle Libre, the unit itself was like $80. And then the doodads that go on your arm are like $60 a pop. I think I got them for two for $60 because I had a good RX coupon. So it's actually fairly cost effective. And this is something like for that patient with type 2 diabetes, I recommended that she ask for one of these as a prescription, because it can be really insightful to just get a sense. Like maybe you think you're being really good and diligent about eating low glycemic, but those, gluten-free cookies or whatever it might be is wreaking more havoc on your blood sugar than you otherwise would have thought. Or maybe there's a surprise food that you think is okay, like brown rice, and it's really messing with your blood sugar more than you realize. But that's something I've been kind of excited about in the last couple of years, especially. And I've seen some patients get really profound, useful data collection from doing that, and it's been really insightful for them.
Really cool. No, I think that that's a really good tip of, if you're wondering if you are having some symptoms of blood sugar swings, and we can maybe go into what that would look like. But if you are, like, doing some self-exploration isn't out of the realm of possibility of you doing on your own. It's pretty easy.
Yeah.
Um, I think the continuous would be awesome. I'm interested in trying that on myself. I've done finger prick stuff,
Mm-hmm.
which again,
Gets old after a while.
yeah, I mean, there's only so much you can prick your prick your finger. And I think too, if you're trying to get like really complete data, it's hard with the finger prick
Yeah.
comparatively to the continuous glucose monitor.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think what you're saying is a really good point about the individuality of the blood sugar response.
Yeah.
I know in the dietetics field, there's a lot of talk of the glycemic index, which I think's kind of being blown up right now. And in that research, what you were describing,
Mm.
it's not really showing that that's a really effective way to manage. It's a very individual
Yeah.
type.
It's a starting point.
Right, right. And there's going to be variance between individuals. I know personally, which we haven't talked about, I had some wild blood sugar swings,
Mm.
where blood sugar was literally in like the 400s,
Woo!
which my doctor thought I had type 1 diabetes, so I got tested.
Gosh.
That was like when I was in the high point of my, or like I should say low point of my SIBO journey. I had these wild blood
Yeah.
sugar swings that were like really uncontrollable. Like
That's bananas.
I tried to monitor it with like, I was someone who was dropping in carbs once I saw these crazy blood sugar swings, because you're like, oh shoot, like I am like flying
I'm
into
doomed.
this. Right, I'm flying into this high blood sugar state. And I'd say like the 400s happened once, and then but I'd still maybe hit like
Still.
a 300 mark. But I would say on average I was going up into like the high 100s to low 200s following a meal. And that'd be a
That's a
meal,
lot.
yeah, and that'd be a meal with really not that many carbs. So it was wild. I will say that when I did treat the SIBO, my blood sugar was way better. So I do think that there was like some layer of it, that some layer of endotoxemia that was going on.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but for me, like again, I got tested a whole bunch, and they're like, you don't have, like, your A1C is fine. It's because I was swinging up and down.
Yeah. So the
So
average
the
was okay.
so the average was okay. So I was
Yeah.
swinging like low for a while, and then I'd go high. And it wasn't like I was staying high either. It's like I'd hit these peaks and then I'd go shooting down.
It's almost worse though. Your poor body is like, oh my God.
Right, right. And I felt bad, and it took I'd say it took a while for me to get blood sugar under control. Um, and there were times it kept, I think there was a constant level of improvement from that point, but I definitely had a lot of blood sugar swings during my journey, and it was not comfortable. You couldn't really focus well when the blood sugar is swinging.
Oh yeah, I'm sure
You
the
don't,
synapses were not synapsing at that
right,
point.
you don't sleep well, so my sleep was pretty disrupted. So I'd kind of wake up at like 2 a.m. and be starving.
Mm,
Um, and kind of craving something to bring my blood sugar up.
yeah,
Um, so, I mean, for me, it was just a wild blood sugar journey, and it took some time to get regulated. But
yeah. Well, I'm glad it did. My gosh. Yeah, and like as a reference point, you were saying that pretty regularly you were getting up into like the high 100s or maybe low 200s after a meal. I mean, I've been monitoring with the CGM for about a week now. I think the highest I've seen, even after a meal, even a meal that contains some carbohydrates, is like 122,
yeah.
maybe. I set my range as kind of an arbitrary range. I set it to try to keep it between like 70 and 120 for the most
Hmm.
part. So I see when it goes just a touch above or below those marks. And yeah, that's pretty damn high.
Well, I think for me, it definitely took me some time to work to a point where I like very easily can do 3 meals a day.
Mm,
Um, I think that what I've seen working with people, I do want to kind of bring it back to like a low carb standpoint as well, and
mm,
why you want to be careful of that you're getting an optimal amount of carbs. I think first you want to make sure that calories are optimal, because that could be in and of itself throwing you into a
yeah.
more blood sugar dysregulated state. But also on the dietary side of things, carbs, I think that we're, especially women, are very sensitive to carb level, which I know we've talked about in the past,
Yeah.
probably more so than men. But carbs are really key because we need a certain level of carbs to prevent activating our stress response.
Hmm.
So we're always supposed to have blood sugar circulating in our body. It feeds our brain. Uh, it feeds a lot of different things. So we need,
Everything.
yeah, we need blood sugar to be stable. And our body has some ways to keep it stable if we're not eating enough carbs. And that that what it does is it needs to generate glucose from protein, and that whole process requires cortisol. So if you're kind of dipping lower in the carbs from a dietary standpoint, your body's going to be kind of activating this cortisol system, activating cortisol to make glucose from protein.
Yeah.
So it's kind of this tricky scenario if you're someone that, might struggle with carbs digestively, because you really need to make sure you're getting enough carbs to balance your cortisol levels and your adrenal system out and your brain gut axis system out, so that it's not stressing your body out.
Hmm.
um, if it's requiring and again, your body can adapt, but it's not necessarily like an optimal scenario in most
Yeah.
cases. So it's really important that you're meeting your carb needs, so that you're not going into this state where your body's basically flying into a stress response to maintain blood glucose
Hmm.
levels. And I see that all the time in the SIBO and IBS space, because
Yeah.
as we've mentioned, there's a lot of fear around carbs and feeding things. And
Well, and that's IBS and SIBO specific and Candida specific, but
right,
also right now we have the world moving in a very carb phobic direction
right,
with,
right.
first it was paleo. Like I sound like such an old timer, but I've seen the rise and relative plateau of paleo, the rise and relative plateau of keto, and now we're getting the rise of carnivore.
Yeah,
It's like I'm just waiting for there to be a diet where it's like you will only eat black pepper, nothing
right.
else. Like I don't know how much more restrictive we can get, but we're going in this direction of carbs are evil, plant foods are evil, and it's really pretty bizarre. And for all that a lot of people, women included, can lose weight doing one of these diets, that doesn't mean that it's the greatest for long-term health purposes. And I do agree with you. I think that our bodies, whether you choose to have children or not, your bodies and your DNA as a woman is hardwired to think you want to have babies.
Right.
And your body, if it perceives that you don't have enough fuel or you're not stable enough or nourished enough to support the life of a baby, it's going to shut down all your hormones. And it's not like there's an off switch on the ovaries where it can say, don't spit out the egg, but keep making the hormones. We want the hormones. Like, it doesn't
Right.
work like
Right.
that. It's just
Right.
like a master shutdown switch where now your hormones are affected. And then keep in mind, too, insulin is just a hormone, point blank. And all
Yeah.
of the hormones chit chat with each other. So
Right.
there is a thyroid insulin axis, there's an estrogen insulin axis. There's all these interconnections between all of the hormones that make this giant, complicated web. And it's really freaking cool. But the takeaway is if you mess with one hormone, you have a great potential to mess with all of the hormones.
Right.
And one of the things that'll really f up your sex hormones, like cholesterol, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, and cortisol, like all of those will go hangwire when you don't have enough carbohydrate coming in.
Right.
Because again, your body is just perceiving starvation mode. We must be in the middle of a famine. The crops didn't do well this year. This isn't a good year to have a baby. Shut it down. And
Isn't
it
it funny, like talking through how the body is responding to things that like are totally foreign to us in reality? Like
right?
the crop's gone, like because food's
Yeah,
so abundant, but like
that
that's a,
was a thing like a
I,
hundred
I
years
know,
ago, even.
I know
In
it's
this day
funny.
and age, we don't have to care about the crops so much. I mean, like maybe one year you won't be able to get bananas or something.
Right,
But,
right.
generally there's going to be something you can eat. But, 150 years ago, that wasn't the story. And certainly not thousands of years ago. So I do think that looking at it from like that evolutionary perspective of just your body being smart enough to shut down reproduction when it needs to and then mucking with the hormones, I think that's really important to know. Um, so I think I've seen it at least once where I was compelled to think, all right, yeah, maybe it was candida making you crave sugar. But what do you think of that hypothesis? Have you seen that to be true, or do you think that's kind of bug paranoia at play?
This is such a great question. I definitely think a lot of cases where they think that their cravings are being driven by microbes are in large part being driven by blood sugar issues. So I think that that happens a lot more than the microbes creating cravings. That's my personal take on things.
I agree.
I do think there definitely is scenarios where the microbes are creating some cravings, but to your point, there is this level of paranoia that I have something living inside me that's creating cravings, like I need to get rid of it. It's similar to the kill mentality that
Yeah.
we always talk about.
Mm-hmm.
It's along the same lines. And I will say too, like even when I had fungal issues, I specifically remember feeling a decrease in cravings with treating them.
Oh.
But again, I was already covering the base of blood sugar balance at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So, but most of the time when I'm working with someone, you almost have to take out that piece of the equation to really see where cravings lie after that.
Mm-hmm.
You want to balance blood sugar and then just see where what happens to cravings because a lot of times they go away because cravings carbs if you're low carb isn't necessarily a bad thing. It could
Yeah.
mean that your body needs more, but it can be filed into this candida craving or whatever mentally, and that's problematic if it is a blood sugar related issue because you could then cut carbs and make the situation worse
Yeah.
if you were already too low carb and that's driving the blood sugar issue.
And you touched on something I think really important there is that like if you're deficient in something and then your body craves the thing you're deficient in, then that's a logical response. And here we
Right,
are
right,
like bad body, bad, bad.
right,
And
right,
it's like I think I might have told you last time when my mom and I went vegetarian for a while, she almost immediately within a couple of months started craving steak and like blood and
right.
meat. And she was iron deficient and her body was telling her, yo man, we need iron, get with it. And that was a logical response. But if you feed into, pun intended, feed into, if you feed into the dogma of any particular nutritional philosophy, like in her case, she was hanging out in hippy dippy Ithaca and hanging around with her vegan and vegetarian pals at her new job. And, it was like it, this hope and this expectation of like, oh, well, I'm going to be vegan. It's the healthy way to go. And kind of like the dogma of the vegan vegetarian mentality. So that, oh, like bad body, why would you crave meat? That's so bad for you. When actually it's like, no, you're nutrient deficient. What are
Right.
you doing? And I think similarly, if you're being really strict on your carbs and not eating carbs and your poor body is like, WTF, I need to make hormones, I need to like regulate my thyroid, I need to nourish myself. Don't be the person who's like slapping your body on the wrist and saying bad body. I think that restriction is the cause of cravings and it's the cause of binging. Can be really
Right.
helpful just conceptually, like the idea of having a bit of carbs, a bit of protein, a bit of fiber, a bit of fat. And
Right.
that way, A, you're getting a wide range of nutrients, but B, you are getting that buffering effect so that your body isn't getting bombarded with any one nutrient excessively. Same thing, like, the whole saturated fat endotoxemia thing.
Right.
Like, if you eat just saturated fat, and I'm calling you out, keto people and carnivore people, if you eat just saturated fat, you're probably ripping open your gut and causing a lot of leaky gut and endotoxemia. But if you eat the same thing, but you eat it with a plant food that has some fiber or some chlorophyll or whatever, that doesn't happen nearly as much.
Right.
So that's a whole other topic we could do. But yeah, I think any one nutrient or any one food in excess has the potential to be problematic. Not because the food is intrinsically unhealthy, it's just that we need balance and our
Right.
microbiome, our microbes need balance and it needs variety to thrive. And you can't bombard your body with any one thing. I think that concept is really important.